Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, March 29th, 2025. We begin with our sister Luyanda Kaboka giving us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne, will be joined on the line by Thomas Aiello, professor of history and African Studies at Valdosta State University in Georgia. For our purposes today, Professor Aiello is the author of the book Mary Turner and the Mob, the Brooks-Lowndes Race Riot of 1918 in History and Memory. Then, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Jamima Pierre, distinguished faculty at the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia in Canada, as well as research associate at the Center for Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. She'll be joining us today to discuss her co-edited book, The Anthropology of White Supremacy, a reader. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Tumani Diabate, Archie Shepp, George Cables, Wynton Marsalis, David Sanborn, and Bobby Hutcherson. Now people get ready for this train a-coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Thomas Aiello.
L'impérialisme, à bas. Le colonialisme, à bas. Le néocolonialisme, à bas. Le sionisme, à bas. L'apartheid, à bas. Foster, à bas. Ian Smith, à bas. Begin, à bas. la révolution! Vive la révolution! Vive le président Sékou Touré! Vive le président Sékou Touré! Vive la révolution africaine! Vive la
Molweni Ekhaya. This is Sister Luyanda with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar and commentaries for the week of March 29th, with commentary by Brother Didon. March 28, 1890. The U.S. passes resettlement law to remove Native Americans from land east of the Mississippi River to further erode Native American presence in the U.S. The genocidal policies of white supremacy continue, and the infamous Trail of Tears begin, with thousands dying from the forced march.
Why does the United States Euro-liberal left movement deny the fact that the United States is a settler colony and posit the centrality of Native Americans, including Mexicans, as central to any solutions to the contradictions of the United States?
March 29th, 1923, the War Resistor League is founded, one of hundreds of anti-war, anti-draft, popular people's organization dedicated to stopping the flow of human capital, human lives, enriching the capitalistic class in the U.S. imperialist wars and campaigns of genocide throughout the world.
In an article, New York Times, March 27, 2005, quote, for military recruiters, a hard toll from a hard sell. For the first time in nearly 5 years, the Army missed its active duty recruitment goals in February. The reserves missed its monthly quota since October. Let us get organized and smash the draft campaign now rather than react after they institute the draft.
March 30th, 1960. The African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, South Africa. Two major anti-colonial movements banned and over 2,000 cadre arrested. This is a result of national strike stay-at-home campaigns where the apartheid government declares a state of emergency.
The Second Tribunal on Death and Destruction in Africa, Madrid, Spain, March 2005. In Didon's presentation, with the outlawing of apartheid, we got Nelson Mandela, and the Europeans got the land, diamond, gold mines, and all of the wealth of South Africa.
March 31st, 1910. Florence Motomelo was born. She was a leading anti-apartheid resistance leader, banned in 1962, arrested in 1964, and died in prison due to horrible neglect. She was a teacher and a mother of 9 children, 4 of which died in infancy.
African women's role, politically and sociologically, is not only critical, but primary for revolutionary change and struggle as their being the first educators of the nation. The mothers, as well as possessing the most fundamental driving force of all societies, procreation and recropiation of a species. We must free up the revolutionary potential of our women from male chauvinistic practices and attitudes within the movement. Slave of a slave.
April 1st, 1967. Formation of the California Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and Liberation of African Peoples, which spread throughout the U.S.
The destruction of the Black Panther Party was primarily due to 5 major ideological changes within a 5-year period, from revolutionary black nationalism to Marxist-Leninism to Mao Zedong thought to Trotskyism into communalism to the Democratic Partyism. The external forces of the FBI and COINTEL manipulated these internal contradictions to murder and frame up its leading cadre. As an oppressed people, our central problem is one of ideology.
April 2nd, 1980. Africans in Brixton, England rise up in urban rebellions against racism.
The worldwide European capitalist oppression of African people globally and historically, and conversely, our resistance can be demonstrated from Australia to India, from Brazil to Nigeria. This is the reason why a highly disciplined global Pan-African party and corresponding mass movement is the only solution to our global oppression.
April 3rd, 1919. The British massacre over 400 and wound over 1,200 at Amritsar, India.
India, the home of the largest national population of black people in the world, is founded on a racist caste system of Hinduism, which permanently places the untouchables, the scheduled caste, in a state of perpetual bondage. Only when African people think globally and react globally can we free up our brothers and sisters in India from this 1,000-year-old caste system.
April 4th, 1968. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated while trying to organize workers in Memphis, Tennessee.
Dr. King's advancing ideological position on the war in Vietnam and on organizing workers into militant trade unions posed a non-resolvable contradiction with the foundation of U.S. capitalism. Within 24 hours of his assassination, over 120 cities in the United States, as well as cities with Africans in England, France, Germany, and the colonized microstates in Africa, rose in mass urban rebellions, heralding a new era of black power and expansion of tactics from solely nonviolence and integration to one of freedom by any means necessary.
April 3rd, 1948. Luisa Amanda Espinosa was born. She was one of the first members of the FSLN, Sandinista National Liberation Front. She protected safe houses for underground comrades and weapons. She was the first FSLN woman to die in the battle at the age of 21.
Imperialism divides and conquer strategy has driven a wedge between younger militants and seasoned militants. Our task must be to destroy this so-called generation gap and link the historical struggles of the elders with the ongoing struggles that our youth are waging today. United we stand.
April 4th, 1988. Angola, SWAPO, and Cuba defeat the racist government of South Africa and the U.S., CIA, and UNITA-backed armies at Quinto Carnaval.
The tri-party unity of Africans from Angola, Namibia, and Cuba were able to stop and defeat the most powerful military force in Africa, the European-dominated South African Defense Force, and its backer, the most powerful military in the world, United States of America. This is one example of many of how Pan-African unity can bury European imperialism.
This has been African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and streaming worldwide on kpfk.org. And in the language of our freedom fighters in South Africa, we want to end with Amandla Awethu, Amandla Awethu, Amandla Awethu.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Thomas Aiello, Professor of History and Africana Studies at Valdosta State University in Georgia, and author of the book, Mary Turner and the Mob, the Brooks-Lowndes Race Riot of 1918 in History and Memory. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Aiello.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. And who was Mary Turner, and why did you decide to write a book about her?
Mary Turner is one of the most kind of influential female victims of lynching in the United States. She was killed in 1918 and has kind of stood as an icon both in South Georgia and in the gendered nature of lynching as a whole, standing as kind of an exception to the general presumption that lynching was a kind of male-only phenomenon.
So what happened to her?
Well, she was the wife of a debt peonage worker, which is how the vast majority of South Georgia farms in the early 20th century were run. In the absence of slavery, they had replaced that system with one wherein locals were arrested on misdemeanor charges, given fines, and then local white planters were paying off the fines of these black misdemeanants and forcing them to work for free on their plantations. Mary Turner was on one of those plantations. The plantation where she was working was particularly brutal in Brooks County, Georgia, right on the Florida border, very, very far South Georgia. And eventually, the debt peons rose up and they killed the owner of the farm in protest and then ran away. That led white South Georgia to go absolutely crazy, and they formed mobs and they went looking for all of these debt peons. And among their victims was Mary Turner's husband, Hayes Turner, who was lynched. Mary Turner protested that lynching and said her husband had nothing to do with it, that he was not part of the cabal to kill the plantation owner. And so the white mob responded by taking her, pulling her from her home in front of her 8-year-old son. And as the story has always been told, took her out to the edge of the county and lynched her in a particularly gruesome way, which has made the story resonate for as long as it has. Instead of the traditional lynching, which is just as horrible, of course, they tied her up instead by her feet instead of by her neck. They set her on fire. They took turns shooting her, and then they opened up her abdomen before she died. She had been, as the story went, 8 months pregnant. They pulled out the fetus and stomped it. I'm sorry, this is graphic. I apologize. And stomped it to death before finally taking turns shooting her and killing her after she had to experience all of that. That story became a national cause celeb, and her lynching, clear lack of any real motive or criminal motive that so often was used, often and almost always unjustly, to kind of have some kind of extrajudicial violence, combined with the grotesqueness of it and the fact that she was a pregnant woman, is going to make her story and the region in South Georgia international news, and will end up sparking the first anti-lynching bills in Congress, even though they don't actually pass.
But as I understand it, you argue in your book that she may not have been pregnant?
That's correct. That is certainly not the reason that I set out to write this project. But yes, it turns out that as far as I can tell, Mary Turner, and the story that has always been told of her lynching, isn't accurate. The woman who was actually 8 months pregnant was the wife of the plantation owner, who the mob claimed had been raped as one of their excuses for why they went out and killed all of these people, which of course is not true. They did not rape her. But she was 8 months pregnant, and she did have a child a month after the original uprising. The story of Mary Turner, I want to say that even though I am challenging the notion that she was pregnant, I want to say she was lynched, and lynching is always horrible, and there is no better or worse version. It is always ugly and terrible. But the NAACP is going to be drawn to South Georgia to investigate this case because it does become this kind of international story, and there newspapers from all over the world are sending reporters to South Georgia, and this idea that you would lynch a pregnant woman becomes a big thing. And the reason that becomes a big thing is because of Walter White. Walter White was not yet the Walter White that we're going to end up knowing. At this point, it was only his second investigation. He was just a young 20-something right out of school. He had done one other investigation in Tennessee before they sent him down to South Georgia. He was relatively new at this. He was only able to find one witness to talk to him, and it was a Black witness who claimed to have been there, at least initially, claimed to have been there at the scene because the guy he worked for was one of the ringleaders of the mob and kind of forced him to go along, and tells him this story. And Walter White writes that story. It appears in the Crisis. It goes everywhere around the world, and it becomes the Mary Turner story that everybody kind of hears. But the story, though Walter White never gave it up, turns out not to have been accurate. A witness that Walter White had eventually recanted, not in public to white people, but refused to go and testify. They needed him badly to testify in Congress if they wanted an anti-lynching bill. Eventually, the president of the NAACP sent letters to Leonidas Dyer, Republican representative from Missouri, who was the sponsor of the main piece. There were several, but the main piece of anti-lynching legislation in Congress, and told him that he had to stop telling the Mary Turner story to try to get people to vote for the anti-lynching bill, that the NAACP could no longer support the story, and that he had to pull it. At the same time, though, the NAACP never publicly said anything about the story. They continued to go with Walter White's version. Walter White continued to tell it for the rest of his life that way. And so it has become the narrative of the Mary Turner lynching, one of the most infamous of the early 20th century.
So you place this lynching in a broader context of what's called the Long Red Summer. That is to say, racist massacres and pogroms visited upon Black people, for example, in East St. Louis, Illinois in 1917 through the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. What else do we need to know about this Long Red Summer?
I think that is the most important part about the Mary Turner story. It is that in elevating what turns out to not be an exactly true story, but certainly one of a specific lynching that very much did happen, what we lose is the fact that Mary Turner was just one of a minimum of 9 victims and a maximum of 19. This was a race riot. This was white people running amok. And it is happening in May of 1918, right in the middle of a sustained period of white group violence that takes place during the World War I era. And I think that's instructive that we can kind of start in 1917, most famously East St. Louis in 1917, and then Tulsa in 21. In the middle of that, in the summer following Mary Turner's death, we have the Red Summer of 1919, so named by James Weldon Johnson, wherein race riots happened in Chicago and Omaha and Washington, all over the country, but also in smaller places like Elaine, Arkansas, and Longview, Texas. And if we contextualize what happens in South Georgia, not as the lynching of a woman, and that's what makes it kind of historically relevant to us, but instead say, well, wait a second, this is actually white people running amok in Black neighborhoods that just happen to be rural, and their body count is similar to what's going on in all of the other places, that we need to kind of contextualize what happens even in the very, very deep South as part of this wave of white retributive violence that is taking place during the war era, where we are supposedly making the world safe for democracy.
Now, back to the Mary Turner lynching. Were any of the perpetrators convicted?
Absolutely not. I will say that one of the supposed perpetrators of the original killing of the white plantation owner was convicted. That is what carries the story even farther. This all happens in 1918, but the last victim of the white mob in Lowndes and Brooks counties actually died 2 days before the Tulsa race riot. And he did so in Savannah, Georgia. He had been pulled from Jacksonville, Florida, where he was claimed to have run after the event. It was later proven that he had nothing to do with it. This was all just a farce. But they took him on the claim that he was there. And they brought him to Savannah, put him on trial, convicted him with no evidence. And his execution happened on Robert E. Lee's birthday, right before Tulsa goes up in flames. And so the last victim of the mob is actually a victim of the legal lynch mob 2 years after those events and right before Tulsa. He is the only person to ever stand trial for any of this violence that takes place in South Georgia, and he was a completely innocent bystander who wasn't even in the area at the time. No of the white perpetrators, the people who actually led the mob and killed all these people, were ever brought to justice. The last victim in 1918 was actually killed with the help of the Valdosta Police Department, was killed in a house that still stands in Valdosta today. And so none of the white perpetrators ever faced, not only did they not face justice, they didn't face any kind of social or any other kind of consequence for this behavior.
So what is the Mary Turner Project, which I understand is operative to this very day?
It absolutely is. The Mary Turner Project began, I think it began like 20 years ago. And the idea was that this area, South Georgia, needed to kind of reconcile with its racial past. And it was formed by a group of locals with the help of some people at Valdosta State. This is before I arrived at the school, to memorialize Mary Turner, but also to kind of use Mary Turner as a fulcrum for kind of opening the door to discuss all the other racial indignities that have occurred in this area historically since slavery. And chief among those, goals was to get kind of public governmental recognition of the Mary Turner lynching as being this kind of important aspect in the area. If you're going to have historical markers for various successes that might have taken place in the area, then you need to have historical markers for all the tragedies that also very much make us who we are. And so they were trying to get a state historical marker and things like that, but also to just publicize racial issues in the community and to ensure that white Valdosta and white South Georgia more broadly didn't gloss over them as historically they kind of always have.
I understand, finally, Professor Aiello, author of the book Mary Turner and the Mob, that with regard to some of the plaques that have been placed in conspicuous vicinity of the episode, the tragic episode, that they've been riddled with gunshots. Should we draw any inferences from that?
Oh, yeah, I think we definitely should. Yes, the historical marker finally was a success. The Mary Turner Project was able to get it placed, and it was placed relatively out of the way because they wanted to place it near where the lynching actually happened, on the border of the counties, Brooks and Lowndes counties, where Mary Turner was actually killed. And so it was out by a bridge on a state highway, but it was a very nice marker and did a good job of telling those things. But they found that having it out there allowed people to come out and take shots at it. Which happened relatively frequently. It became a place where good old boys would go out and drink and shoot up the sign. And eventually, they ended up coming to this kind of crossroads, and we had a variety of meetings with the state historical marker people, and eventually we decided to put up a metal cross where Mary Turner was killed, which is still there, which is essentially bulletproof. I mean, it is just kind of this iron cross that you can't really do anything with. And we moved the marker to a local town nearby and put it on the campus of one of the larger Black churches in a town called Hehaira that has video cameras, surveillance, security system, essentially. And so the shot up marker is now in a museum in Atlanta, less as part of the story of Mary Turner, and more as an emblem of the racial intransigence in this region that still very much exists, because those bullet holes were not put there in the early 20th century. They were put there in the 21st. And so it is a reminder to us that while this region has not experienced the same kinds of race riots, the same kinds of mass murders that were taking place in the early 20th century. The motives for those efforts, the racial intransigence that underlaid them, is still in many ways there. And taking out your racial frustrations on a symbol that was designed to highlight the victimhood of a Black woman is meaningful and says a lot about your lack of fear that there will be any consequences for that, and that it will be seen as something that is essentially justified by the community. And of course, it is. There's never been any punishment for any of those gunshots that went into the historical marker.
Well, Thomas Aiello, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, to discuss your riveting book, Mary Turner and the Mob.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Jamima Pierre, distinguished faculty at the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and research associate at the Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and co-editor of the new book, The Anthropology of White Supremacy, a reader. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Pierre.
Thanks so much for having me. My pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is ours, I assure you. So why did you collaborate in producing this book?
Yes, well, as the title reveals, this is a book written edited by anthropologists for primarily an anthropology audience, but hopefully that this will be a much broader audience than anthropology. And there's an origin to this story, and part of it is as scholars of color within this discipline of anthropology, which is supposedly a very liberal discipline in terms that it's not as rigid as economics per se, or as imperialist as political science, so they like to think. And there's a long history of Black and brown scholars challenging anthropology as the handmaiden of colonialism and imperialism. And for the longest time, anthropology in particular, from the 60s on, even with the critiques of its work, never wanted to deal with the race. There was what they call a so-called Boasian revolution, which is Franz Boas, this Jewish American anthropologist who basically shaped the way that American anthropology was done in terms of focusing not on race, which is what anthropology started. And I have to say, anthropology started as the science of race, as anthropology is one of the fields that constructed the idea of race and justified brutality based on this notion of racial inferiority and superiority. So what anthropologists did in the 60s to deal with the pushback by former people who were colonized and who were the key objects of anthropological study was basically say that we'll no longer talk about race because race is biology, we'll talk about culture. So culture became the key term for anthropology to do its work. But in so doing, there was no room to talk about white supremacy and talk about continued racial exploitation, and so on. And so Black scholars in particular have been challenging anthropology, calling it, the refusal to talk about race. And so this is the context out of which we started thinking about this issue. And, there's been some moves within the discipline to talk about race. So, for example, there are a lot of Black scholars, a lot of their ethnographies, their studies are about racial discrimination, racial identity formation, structural white supremacy. And we realized that what we actually needed to talk about was white supremacy, because race did not do enough in terms of thinking about the power of whiteness in the world. And so we decided we started having this discussion in the spring of 2016, and to put together a conference paper for the American Anthropological Association, a panel on the anthropology of white supremacy. Little did we know back then, we put together this panel back in January 2016, little did we know that Trump was actually going to win the election. So we went from having a marginal panel where they placed us at 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning because anthropologists really do not want to talk about race. That became a huge overpacked panel of a lot of people because they came to us to figure out how to deal, the liberals, how to deal with Trump, how to deal with the Trump presidency in 2016. And that's when we realized it was really frustrating in the sense that what we wanted to show was not to talk about, the resurgence of white nationalism or these, the Proud Boys or these explicit, white supremacist groups, but to actually establish the long history of white supremacy throughout the world, but also within the discipline and in the US. And we saw that the split in that was really interesting to us because everyone wanted to come and basically treat Trump as the epitome of white supremacy, where we wanted to say, well, no, the entire world is structured through white supremacy, and especially our discipline, which has a role in consolidating white supremacy. So that's where we were. And this panel ended up being a special issue in the American Anthropologist, which was the flagship journal, but not without a 2-year fight where they kept rejecting the panel, saying that they did not want to publish. All the essays in the introduction kept getting rejected based on several points. And part of it was not wanting to deal with race. And so finally, we published it as a special issue. And then later on, we were approached by a couple of presses, and we went with Princeton to write this book, to edit this book and create a reader, and to actually expand it to include all the various spaces around the world, to actually consolidate the view that white supremacy is not unique to the US or South Africa. So that's really the origin story of the book.
With regard to the United States, could you elaborate on what your contributors have to say about white supremacy in the United States of America?
Well, as we all who read Dr. Horne know that, the white supremacy is built into and structured into the United States, right? And so we cannot understand any aspect of U.S. politics, economics, culture, without understanding that the original establishment of the U.S. was about consolidating white supremacy. And as you document very well in your book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, but white supremacy is built into the U.S. system, through, and this is what we talk about when we historicize, in the book, we historicize white supremacy. So the way to answer this might be to say that we historicize white supremacy to say that it is linked to the expansion of Europeans and conquest of the majority of the world, the extirpation of extirpation of indigenous populations in the Americas and throughout the world, the enslavement of Africans, and the establishment of the rise of capitalism. All these come together to establish white supremacy. So when we historicize it like that, what we say then is that white supremacy is global. And so the US part of that is just one set of articulations of white supremacy that we find elsewhere. What's unique about the US is that it's also an empire. And so then its tentacles are everywhere. But within the US, white supremacy is the founding structure of this country. It's through, the histories of Jim Crow. And it's not just about like explicit segregation, but it's built into the education system. It's built into the legal structure. It's built into everything. Even modes of thinking, epistemology, history is built into the various disciplines. And so this is what white supremacy is in the US in particular. And then it's articulated outside because the US is an empire. So then its relationships with the rest of the world is very much based on this notion of, whiteness is power, and those in the position of those in the position of power have, are about maintaining white superiority. Now, the US is interesting as well in the sense that one of the arguments that we make is we talk about white supremacy, it also in excess of the corporeal, the skin, right? In the sense that there are people of color who also uphold white supremacist views and ideas, right? So, anyone working with the U.S. State Department, anyone who's a president of the U.S. or members, before, when, anyone who's part of the U.S. state is, they work to uphold the state and to uphold the white supremacist nature of the state. And so in that sense, the U.S. is very much at the heart of it right now, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, Senegal, the West African nation, is also part of your book. How so?
Yeah, Senegal is about thinking about our one of our scholars. I'm looking for the name, the title of her article, where she focuses on, it's called The Obscuring Effect, Whiteness in the Celebration of Black Performance in Senegal. And it's really, one of the important things about this book is it's a combination of theoretical expositions as well as ethnography, which is the key methodology of anthropology. And so this is an ethnographic study of the ways that white capoeira dancers go to Senegal to basically teach capoeira to Senegalese, which is fascinating considering capoeira is Brazilian, coming from the Afro-Brazilian cultures. And so this is a study about how it is that these white people who went to Brazil to learn capoeira then turn around and go back to Senegal and basically establish themselves as the people to basically teach Senegalese Black culture. So it's a really fascinating study of thinking about, which brings together the idea of these expats, right? What we call immigrants in other countries. When white people do it, they're called expats in Africa. It actually points to this idea that, to me, this is clear in the sense of thinking about race in Africa. Most people don't want to talk about how race works in Africa because people are prone to think about so-called, tribal violence or ethnic identities as if African societies are not structured by race and white supremacy as well. And our viewpoint is that because of colonialism, because of slavery, every single society is shaped by race and white supremacy. And so Senegal is one of them. And this is a particular example of how white supremacy is actually articulated, perpetuated in the context of this cultural movement that is being carried to Senegal through white women in particular, and what it means to actually reaffirm whiteness as the key site of power in Senegal, while at the same time deploying Blackness in very fascinating ways.
You too, as we all know, are a celebrated anthropologist. So what is your contribution to this volume?
My contribution is rereading. What I do is rereading what this chapter should have been called, and right now it's called Africanist Anthropology, Race, Power, and the Politics of Otherness. And so it's really rereading of the classic texts of anthropology. And anthropology has been accused by African scholars, in particular radical African scholars, of racism, of any deployment of any study, of any anthropological study of Africans ends up actually reasserting African inferiority, whether it's cultural or racial. And so there are all these critiques of anthropology texts, especially in the 60s and 70s, by scholars from Evie Mudimbe, who wrote The Invention of Africa, to other scholars who basically, who critique anthropology of using a particular kind of vernacular when it comes to Africans that actually is about race, even when they don't talk about race. And so my article then is about the three classics that are relevant in terms of the way that white Africanist engagement with African societies becomes some of the most powerful sites of racialization. And I reviewed the Nuer, which is it's one of the classic anthropology texts. The Nuer are a group of people that are found in East Africa as one of the most studied, the most storied group of East Africans in anthropology. Everyone reads this text. And it's really, I don't think people realize it's based on the Nuer as a Nilotic people, which is based on the theory of the Hamitic hypothesis of, these pastoralists who go and basically create culture in East Africa. I also reviewed the Forest people, and then I did Nisa, the Life and Worlds of a Kong Woman, which is supposedly a classic feminist text. And basically read them in basically demonstrating how built into the language, the description of Africa and Africans is a particular kind of dehumanization that goes through the language of culture, particular kinds of representation, particular kinds of linking Africans to animals in these texts. And so that's what my book does. And it's that even if Africanists, the Africanists are the people, are the white anthropologists who study Africa, that they don't acknowledge that racism is one of the most fundamental part of the world and of the discipline, they continue to actually continue to uphold the ideological and epistemological belief in an African exceptionalism, right? And they create this African exceptionalism by always contrasting Africans, or whatever Africans do, African actions, to, however implicit, to a white European civilization. And so that's what the text does, is basically show that it's baked into all these ethnographies, and how Africa actually becomes the key site for racialization, has always been one of the key sites for racialization for anthropology. And I wanted to just quickly say what I didn't say about the book, about the introduction, about the introduction that we wrote. And I'm hoping that people can read that introduction, because one of the reasons we focus on anthropology is because anthropology is one of the interventions we wanted is to demonstrate the significance of the discipline of anthropology to the construction of race. People don't realize that it is anthropology that gave us the science of race. It is through anthropology that we had measurements of skulls, the counting of, the thinking about distribution of nose type and in the construction of different groups of people. And so it is through the earlier anthropology scholars, European scientists such as Karl Linnaeus, the German Johann Blumenbach, as well as the American School of Anthropology, through the work of Samuel Morton, by the way, and whose bones, by the way, were that he kept at the University of Pennsylvania were part of a controversy in 2020 and 2021. And so racial science that anthropology began is really what worked to justify continued exploitation and to entrench notions of white superiority.
In light of the problems that this book addresses, what is the consensus amongst progressive and radical anthropologists as to what is to be done?
Yeah, so I'm not sure there is consensus. One of the key things that we wanted to actually show is actually to name whiteness and to name white supremacy as key to key to this world, to the relationships of this world, and key to the discipline. And so I'm not even sure we're there in the sense of getting people to understand white supremacy in the discipline, white supremacy of the discipline in the world. And so the consensus is that there's racism. It's very difficult still to get anthropologists in particular to actually confront white supremacy as a global phenomenon. And so we're hoping that this is what the reader does, because one of the key things that I've always demonstrated in my own work is how easy it is for people to say, oh, race, white supremacy, that's only the US and South Africa. And people can't figure out how to understand what kind of language to describe what they're seeing as white supremacy. And so what we wanted to show was in every part of the world, we can show definite examples down to, even in Europe, right? Which is a place that we should actually assume white supremacy works, but thinking about, the North and the Nordic areas and places like that. And so the point is to move against the US and South African exceptionalism when we're talking about white supremacy, to move against this notion that it's only the Proud Boys or whatever these, white nationalist fascist groups are doing right now, and Trump and Elon and the tech people, that it is much more baked in. And if it wasn't baked into US and global society, so much the US would, we would not, for example, have 74 million people vote for Trump, or we would not have the Europe, get back into its default political position, which is white supremacy and fascism. And so that's what we want to do, is demonstrate, get out of that US and South African exceptionalism when it comes to thinking about race and white supremacy, and demonstrate it's all over the world. I think once we do that, once we get more people with buy-in to understand how deeply embedded white supremacy and the privileging of whiteness is in all of our societies, I think once we do that, then maybe we can have more consensus. The other thing I wanted to point to is we do say that we cannot get rid of white supremacy without getting rid of capitalism and US and having and US imperialism. And I think that's the other thing that I think that's unique to this book is the talk about capitalism linked to white supremacy, but also the talk about U.S. imperialism as it's articulating itself in the world today.
Finally, Professor Pierre, co-editor of the volume, The Anthropology of White Supremacy, a reader. To the youth in our audience, would you recommend that they study at the University of British Columbia in Western Canada?
I definitely would. I actually think most people don't understand how important, how significant some of these universities are. People in the U.S. outside of Canada, for example, a lot of them don't think that Canadian universities are as good as U.S. universities. What's interesting, since I've been teaching here, is that there are quite a number of students from the U.S. as well as from all over the world. And I would definitely recommend students come here. And of course, I would love for them to come. They should come and apply to the Social Justice Institute here. We have some departments that are that are more liberal than others, such as the geography department. We even have African-American scholars teaching in the history and English department. And so this is a great place to be, in the sense that you can get a radical education, but also it's one of the places where it is extremely global. I don't think I've ever taught in a place where I have so many students from all over the world, because this is a global university. So I would definitely suggest it. I would definitely suggest thinking about Canadian universities as an option outside of the U.S. context.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Pierre, co-editor of the volume, The Anthropology of White Supremacy, a reader. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guest, Professor Thomas Aiello from Valdosta State University in Georgia, as well as Professor Jemima Pierre from the University of British Columbia in Canada. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to Sister Luyanda Kaboka on the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, as well as our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Babadidan Kamathi. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org and scroll down to Freedom Now to hear this program, as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.